The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Sterling Tower, one of the tallest buildings in downtown Manhattan. The gleaming surfaces reflected the light in patterns that danced across the expensive artwork adorning the walls, each piece carefully selected by an interior designer who charged more per hour than most people earned in a month. Richard Sterling adjusted his Italian silk tie, a piece that cost more than most people earned in a week, and checked his Rolex Submariner as he stepped out of his private elevator onto the 40th floor. The watch was a limited edition, one of only 50 made worldwide, and Richard wore it like a badge of honor, a visible symbol of his membership in an exclusive club of the ultra-wealthy. At 45 years old, he had built what appeared to be an empire from nothing, or so he liked to tell people at charity galas, business conferences, and exclusive private clubs where the annual membership fees exceeded the average American salary. The truth was more complicated and less heroic, involving a substantial inheritance from a great-uncle he had barely known, several questionable business deals in his early years that skirted the edges of legality, and a willingness to destroy competitors through methods that would have made a corporate raider blush. But Richard had long since rewritten that history in his own mind, crafting a mythology of self-made success that he had come to believe as fervently as any religious doctrine. His company, Sterling Enterprises, owned or managed nearly half the commercial real estate in the city through a complex web of holding companies, shell corporations, and strategic partnerships. Richard never let anyone forget this fact, dropping references to his properties into casual conversation the way other people mentioned the weather. He had framed newspaper articles about his business success lining the hallways of his office suite, each one carefully matted and positioned to catch the light, monuments to his own perceived brilliance and proof of his superiority over the masses who struggle to pay rent in buildings he owned. His assistant, Margaret, hurried to keep pace with his long strides as they walked toward the conference room where today's quarterly board meeting would unfold. She was a woman in her 50s who had worked for Richard for over a decade, enduring his moods and demands with the quiet professionalism of someone who had learned that survival in his orbit required anticipating his needs before he expressed them and absorbing his criticism without visible reaction. Today was one of the most important meetings of the fiscal year, where Richard would once again demonstrate his dominance over his competitors, his board members, and his own employees. He thrived on these moments of pure power, feeding off the fear and admiration in people's eyes, like a predator sensing weakness in its prey. The power dynamic was everything to him, the visible proof that he had risen above his humble beginnings in a cramped apartment in Queens, where his mother had cleaned other people's houses, and his father had worked double shifts at a factory that slowly destroyed his lungs and his spirit. "Sir, the board members are all present and accounted for, and the quarterly reports are ready for your review," Margaret said, her voice slightly breathless as she struggled to match his purposeful stride down the carpeted hallway. She carried a thick leather portfolio stuffed with documents, financial projections, market analyses, and competitive intelligence reports that had taken her team of analysts weeks to prepare and verify. "The coffee service has been set up exactly as you specified, and I've confirmed that the presentation equipment is functioning properly." "Excellent. Make sure the coffee is perfect this time, not like last week's disaster," Richard replied without looking at her, his eyes already focused on the power play that awaited him in the conference room. He had specific opinions about everything, from the exact temperature of the coffee to the precise positioning of documents on the mahogany table, and he used these seemingly trivial details as opportunities to assert his control over everyone around him. A lukewarm cup of coffee became evidence of incompetence. A slightly crooked presentation slide became proof that his staff lacked attention to detail, and any deviation from his expectations became a reason to remind people of their expendability. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy as 12 board members sat around the polished mahogany table that had cost more than a luxury sports car. The table was Richard's particular pride, handcrafted by artisans in northern Italy and shipped to New York at enormous expense, every detail designed to impress and intimidate. The wood had been selected from trees that were over 200 years old, and the craftsmanship was so exquisite that each grain pattern seemed to tell a story of ancient forests and patient artistry. Everything in the room was calculated to overwhelm visitors with displays of wealth and power, from the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of the Manhattan skyline, to the leather chairs that had been specially designed to position Richard's seat slightly higher than all the others, a subtle but unmistakable reminder of hierarchy and authority. Richard entered the room like a monarch entering his court, his presence commanding immediate and complete silence. Conversations died mid-sentence, nervous coughs were suppressed, and all eyes turned toward him with a mixture of respect, fear, and barely concealed resentment. He paused in the doorway for a moment, savoring the effect of his entrance, watching as powerful men and women who controlled millions of dollars in their own right suddenly became as nervous as children called to the principal's office. He took his seat at the head of the table with deliberate ceremony and surveyed his kingdom with visible satisfaction. These 12 people represented some of the most successful executives and investors in the city, but in this room, under his gaze, they were merely subjects awaiting his pronouncements and hoping to avoid his displeasure. "Gentlemen and lady," he said, nodding toward Catherine Morrison, the single female board member who had earned her position through decades of brilliant financial analysis and strategic thinking, but whom Richard still treated as a token presence rather than recognizing her substantial contributions to the company's success. "Another remarkably successful quarter for Sterling Enterprises. Our profits are up 37% year over year, our portfolio has expanded into 3 new markets, and our competitors are struggling to keep up with our aggressive expansion strategy and superior market positioning." For the next 2.5 hours, Richard dominated the meeting with the skill and ruthlessness of a seasoned performer who understood that business was ultimately theater, and that the most convincing performance usually determined the outcome. He had charts and graphs projected on the wall-mounted screens, each one carefully designed and color-coded to showcase his company's superior performance across every meaningful metric. He made decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in investments with casual authority, dismissing concerns and overruling objections with the supreme confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged or forced to confront the consequences of his choices. He particularly enjoyed shooting down ideas from younger board members, especially those who had earned their business degrees from prestigious universities but lacked what he called real-world experience. These bright young executives with their fancy educations and their idealistic notions about corporate responsibility and sustainable business practices were easy targets for his wit and experience. Watching them shrink back into their expensive chairs when he dismissed their suggestions with cutting remarks gave him a satisfaction that he would never have admitted to anyone, not even himself. "Peterson," he said to a young analyst who had dared to suggest a more conservative approach to their latest acquisition, a move that would have preserved jobs but reduced short-term profits. When you've built something from scratch like I have, when you've risked everything and fought your way to the top of this industry, then you can question my strategies and my decision-making process. Until then, I suggest you stick to running numbers and leave the strategic thinking to people who have actually proven they know how to succeed in the real world. The room fell into uncomfortable silence, and Peterson's face flushed red with embarrassment and suppressed anger. But like everyone else in Richard's orbit, he said nothing, swallowing his pride and his professional dignity. The paycheck was too good, the career opportunities too valuable, the professional connections too important to risk confronting the man who controlled their professional futures and could destroy their reputations with a few well-placed phone calls. After the meeting concluded with the usual round of obligatory congratulations and forced enthusiasm, Richard decided to treat himself to lunch at his favorite restaurant, Les Bernardins, one of the most exclusive and expensive establishments in the city. It was a place where reservations were nearly impossible to obtain unless you were someone genuinely important, someone whose name carried weight in the circles that mattered. Richard relished the fact that the maitre d' knew him by name, always had a prime table available regardless of how busy they were, and treated him with the sort of deferential respect that money could buy, but character had to earn. The restaurant served as another stage for his ongoing performance of success, another venue where he could demonstrate his superiority over the masses who could never afford such luxury, who would never be welcomed into such exclusive circles, who would never understand what it felt like to have unlimited access to the finest things in life. As he walked through the lobby of Sterling Tower, Richard noticed the usual crowd of admirers, employees, and hangers-on who seemed to materialize whenever he appeared in public spaces. There was something magnetic about wealth and power, he had learned over the years, something that drew people like iron filings to a magnet. Some wanted to bask in his reflected glory, hoping that proximity to success might somehow improve their own circumstances. Others hoped to catch his attention and advance their own careers by positioning themselves as useful or entertaining. Still others simply enjoyed being near power, feeling important by association, collecting stories they could tell at cocktail parties about their brief interactions with Richard Sterling. He loved the attention, thrived on it like a plant reaching toward sunlight. He loved the way people stepped aside to let him pass as if he were royalty moving through a crowd of commoners. He loved the whispered conversations that followed in his wake as people speculated about his latest business moves, wondered about his personal life, or simply marveled at what it would be like to have such wealth and influence. These moments of public recognition were almost as satisfying as the quarterly profit reports, tangible proof that he had transcended his origins and achieved something that most people could only dream about. The restaurant was only 3 blocks away through Manhattan's bustling financial district, and Richard genuinely enjoyed the walk, despite having a chauffeur-driven car at his disposal. It gave him another opportunity to display his power and wealth to a broader audience, to remind the city that Richard Sterling was a force to be reckoned with. His custom-tailored suit had been crafted by a British tailor whose client list included members of Parliament and European nobility. The fabric was a wool-silk blend that cost more per yard than most people spent on an entire wardrobe, and it fit him with the precision that only came from multiple fittings and obsessive attention to detail. His handmade Italian shoes, crafted by artisans who had been perfecting their techniques for generations, cost more than many people's monthly rent. They clicked against the pavement with authority, each step announcing his presence and importance to anyone within earshot. His confident stride had been developed over years of boardroom battles and high-stakes negotiations, refined through countless confrontations, where showing weakness or uncertainty could cost millions of dollars and destroy careers. As he approached the restaurant, Richard noticed a small commotion on the sidewalk that disrupted the usual orderly flow of pedestrian traffic. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, was crouched beside what appeared to be a carefully prepared street vendor setup. She had positioned a clean cardboard box as her base and covered it with a pristine white cloth that looked like it had been ironed that morning. On top of this improvised table, she was methodically arranging what appeared to be handmade jewelry, each piece placed with the careful attention of someone who understood that presentation could make the difference between a sale and a dismissal. Her clothes were simple and practical, obviously chosen for comfort and durability rather than fashion or status. She wore dark jeans that showed signs of careful maintenance, with patches at the knees that had been applied with skill and attention to color matching. Her white cotton blouse had clearly seen many washings, but was still crisp and neat, tucked in with military precision. Her comfortable sneakers showed signs of extensive walking, but were clean and well-maintained, suggesting someone who took pride in her appearance despite obvious financial constraints. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, secured with what appeared to be one of her own handmade hair accessories, a clever bit of marketing that showcased her work while serving a functional purpose. She wore minimal makeup, just a light application of lip balm that caught the afternoon sunlight and gave her face a natural, healthy glow that no amount of expensive cosmetics could have improved upon. She looked up as people passed by, offering genuine smiles and quiet explanations about her jewelry to anyone who showed even the slightest interest. Her voice was soft but clear, educated but not pretentious, carrying the slight accent that suggested she had grown up in New York but had spent time in other places. She spoke with the infinite patience of someone accustomed to being overlooked or dismissed, someone who had learned that persistence and politeness were more effective than pushiness or desperation. "Excuse me," she said politely to a passing businessman in an expensive gray suit who was hurrying towards some urgent appointment. "Would you like to see some handmade earrings? They're made with genuine sterling silver and semi-precious stones from Brazil. Very reasonable prices for the quality." The businessman barely glanced at her display before hurrying past without acknowledgement, his face set in the determined expression of someone who had trained himself not to see the humanity in street vendors, panhandlers, and anyone else who might slow down his important progress through the world. His dismissal was so complete and automatic that he probably didn't even register her as a person, just another obstacle to navigate around on his way to more important things. The girl's shoulders slumped slightly at the rejection, a barely perceptible reaction that spoke of countless similar encounters. But she continued arranging her modest display with careful attention to detail. She adjusted the position of a delicate bracelet here, straightened a necklace there, repositioned a pair of earrings to catch the light more effectively. There was something almost meditative about her movements, as if the act of creating order and beauty from her small collection of handmade pieces was a form of prayer or contemplation. Richard stopped walking and found himself studying the scene with growing irritation that he couldn't quite articulate or understand. Something about the girl's presence on this particular corner, in this neighborhood where he conducted his most important business, offended him on a level that went beyond mere inconvenience. Here he was, a man who could buy the entire city block without checking his bank balance or consulting with financial advisors. And this girl was cluttering up the sidewalk with her pathetic attempt at commerce. She represented everything he despised about modern society, everything he had risen above through sheer force of will, superior intelligence, and relentless determination. She was poor, obviously desperate, reduced to hawking trinkets on street corners like some kind of medieval peasant who hadn't gotten the message that the world had moved beyond such primitive forms of commerce. She was everything he had escaped from through his own efforts, everything that reminded him of his own humble origins in that cramped apartment in Queens, where the walls were thin, the heat rarely worked properly, and his parents had struggled to pay rent on time every month. But more than her poverty, what really bothered him was her apparent lack of shame about her circumstances. She didn't display the proper deference that Richard expected from people in her obviously inferior position. She looked potential customers directly in the eye, rather than averting her gaze submissively. She spoke with confidence about her products, rather than apologizing for taking up space on the sidewalk. She carried herself with a dignity that Richard found inappropriate given her obvious poverty and failure to achieve anything meaningful in life. In Richard's carefully constructed worldview, poor people should be grateful for any attention from their social and economic superiors. They should understand their place in the natural hierarchy that separated winners from losers, should acknowledge their failures with appropriate humility, should demonstrate through their demeanor that they recognized the vast gulf between themselves and people who had actually succeeded in life. In Richard's carefully constructed worldview, poor people should be grateful for any attention from their social and economic superiors. They should understand their place in the natural hierarchy that separated winners from losers, should acknowledge their failures with appropriate humility, should demonstrate through their demeanor that they recognized the vast gulf between themselves and people who had actually succeeded in life. A small crowd had gradually gathered around Richard, as inevitably happened whenever he paused in any public space. Word seemed to travel through some invisible network that Richard Sterling was present, and people materialized as if summoned by an unspoken signal. His employees, including Margaret and two junior associates who had been trailing behind him at a respectful distance, formed the inner circle. A few business associates who had recognized him on the street joined the group, along with several passers-by who had noticed his expensive clothing and confident demeanor and correctly identified him as someone important worth watching. They formed a loose semicircle around him, an impromptu audience waiting to see what wisdom or pronouncement he might offer, ready to laugh appreciatively at his jokes, nod approvingly at his observations, or simply bask in the reflected glory of being near someone with genuine power and influence. This was the sort of spontaneous demonstration of his importance that Richard lived for, proof that he had transcended ordinary existence and achieved something that commanded automatic respect and attention. Richard saw his audience and felt the familiar rush of power coursing through his veins like the most addictive drug ever created. Here was a perfect opportunity to demonstrate his superiority, to remind everyone present of the natural order of things that he had spent his entire adult life establishing and defending through ruthless competition and strategic intimidation. The wealthy belonged at the top of society because they had earned their position through superior intelligence, harder work, and stronger character. The poor belonged at the bottom, scrambling for scraps and accepting charity because they lacked the vision, determination, and moral fiber necessary for real success. This was not cruelty in Richard's mind, but education. He was providing a valuable public service, teaching this girl and everyone watching about the realities of the world, the consequences of not applying oneself properly to the serious business of accumulating wealth and achieving success. Someone needed to explain to her why her current approach to life was doomed to failure, why she would never achieve anything meaningful through such pathetic efforts, why she should be grateful that someone of his stature was taking time from his busy schedule to offer her guidance. He approached the young woman with deliberate, heavy steps, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete sidewalk with the rhythmic authority of a judge's gavel. Each step was calculated to draw maximum attention, to announce his presence and importance to everyone within earshot, to create the sort of dramatic buildup that would make his eventual pronouncement more impactful and memorable. She looked up as his shadow fell across her small display, temporarily blocking the afternoon sunlight that had been illuminating her jewelry. Richard was genuinely struck by her eyes in a way that momentarily disrupted his planned performance and made him question his initial assessment of the situation. They were dark brown, almost black in the shadowed light, and they held an intelligence and depth that seemed completely at odds with her circumstances. More surprisingly, there was a quiet confidence in her gaze, a steadiness that suggested she was neither impressed by his obvious wealth and status, nor intimidated by his commanding presence. Instead of the desperate gratitude or fearful deference he expected to see, her expression held something he couldn't immediately identify. It was as if she were studying him, evaluating him, coming to conclusions about his character that he wasn't sure he wanted to know. For just a moment, Richard felt like the one being judged rather than the one passing judgment, and the sensation was deeply unsettling. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" Richard asked, his voice deliberately loud enough for the growing crowd of spectators to hear clearly. He modulated his tone carefully to convey both unquestioned authority and barely controlled disdain, the voice of a man accustomed to having his questions answered immediately and completely, without evasion or excuses. The girl looked up at him with those unsettling steady eyes, and Richard noticed with growing irritation that she didn't immediately avert her gaze as most people in her position would have done. Instead, she met his stare directly, as if she considered herself his equal rather than recognizing the vast gulf between their respective positions in society. "I'm selling jewelry, sir. Handmade pieces that I create in my workshop. Would you like to examine them more closely?" Her voice carried no hint of the subservience Richard expected, no acknowledgement of the obvious difference between their social and economic positions, no recognition that she was speaking to someone far more important than herself. Richard laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the sidewalk like the crack of a whip, making several people in the growing crowd wince with visible discomfort. It was the laugh of someone who had never learned to find genuine humor in life, someone who only laughed when other people's misfortunes or failures provided entertainment. "Jewelry? You actually have the audacity to call this junk jewelry?" He picked up a delicate silver bracelet from her display, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated with something infectious. The piece was actually quite beautiful, Richard had to admit privately, featuring intricate wirework that showed genuine skill and a small amethyst stone that caught the light beautifully. But he examined it with exaggerated disgust, turning it this way and that so the crowd could see his disdain and share in his assessment of its worthlessness. "This looks like something a child might make in summer camp arts and crafts. Did you find this in a box of breakfast cereal? Are you seriously expecting people to pay money for this amateur nonsense?" The girl's face remained remarkably calm and composed, though Richard noticed a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested his words were having at least some of the intended effect. Her hands, which had been perfectly steady while arranging her jewelry display, now showed the slightest tremor that indicated he was successfully undermining her confidence. but her voice remained level and professional when she responded. "I make each piece myself, sir, in a workshop I've set up in Brooklyn. The materials are all genuine sterling silver and authentic gemstones. The amethyst in that bracelet is from Brazil, specifically from mines near Minas Gerais, and the silver meets all industry standards for purity and durability." "Quality? Industry standards?" Richard's voice rose another octave, drawing even more attention from passers-by who were beginning to slow their pace to watch the unfolding confrontation. "Do you have any concept of what real quality looks like? Do you understand who you're talking to right now?" He held up his gold Rolex with theatrical flourish, letting the afternoon sunlight catch its face and send reflections dancing across the surrounding buildings. "I own more than half the commercial real estate on this street. I wear accessories that cost more than you probably earn in an entire year of sitting on sidewalks. This watch alone represents more wealth than everything you own combined, including whatever pathetic apartment you're living in." The crowd had grown substantially larger now, forming an increasingly dense circle around the confrontation. Richard could feel their attention like a physical force, feeding his need to dominate and humiliate this girl who had dared to set up her pathetic business in his neighborhood. Some people in the crowd looked visibly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, shifting from foot to foot and glancing around as if hoping someone would intervene to stop what was clearly becoming a cruel public humiliation. Others seemed fascinated by the spectacle, their faces showing the sort of morbid curiosity that drew people to watch car accidents or public arguments. But no one dared to intervene or challenge Richard's behavior. Everyone on the street understood instinctively that Richard Sterling was too powerful, too well-connected, too dangerous to cross. His reputation for destroying anyone who opposed him was well known throughout the business community, and even casual observers seemed to sense that confronting him could have serious consequences for their own lives and careers. "Look at yourself," Richard continued, gesturing at the girl's simple clothing with theatrical contempt that was clearly performed for the benefit of his audience. "Look at your shoes, your clothes, your entire pathetic setup here. You're sitting on a dirty city sidewalk like some kind of professional beggar, like someone who's completely given up on having any real success or dignity in life." He paused dramatically, letting his words sink in before delivering what he intended as the killing blow. "Don't you have any self-respect? Any understanding of what it means to be a productive member of society? Any shame about the fact that you're cluttering up a respectable business district with this embarrassing display?" The girl stood up slowly, and Richard was genuinely surprised to see that she was taller than he had expected, perhaps 5 feet 7 inches in her simple sneakers. She brushed off her jeans with quiet dignity, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both practicality and grace despite the obviously inexpensive clothing. When she met his gaze directly, Richard felt another momentary flicker of that same unsettling sensation, as if she were seeing something in him that he preferred to keep hidden. "I work hard for everything I have, sir. There's no shame in honest work, whether it's conducted in a corporate boardroom or on a street corner." "Honest work?" Richard's laugh was even more cruel now, specifically designed to cut and wound, to reduce this girl to tears in front of the dozens of people who were now watching their interaction with fascination. "You're cluttering up the sidewalk, bothering real customers who have actual money to spend, driving down property values in a neighborhood where serious business gets conducted by serious people." He gestured expansively at the expensive buildings surrounding them. "You want honest work? Go get a real job that contributes something meaningful to society. work in a factory, clean office buildings, flip burgers at a fast food restaurant. Anything but this pathetic display of self-pity and entitlement. The girl's hands, which had been remarkably steady throughout the encounter, now trembled visibly as she clasped them together in front of her. But her voice remained calm and controlled when she spoke, displaying a strength of character that Richard found both surprising and increasingly infuriating. "I do have a job, sir. I work 20 hours a week at a nonprofit organization that helps provide job training for people transitioning out of homelessness. This jewelry business is just something I do in my spare time to help pay for my education and to connect with people in the community." Education? Community? Richard seized on these new targets, like a predator sensing wounded prey that was trying to escape. Let me guess what kind of education we're talking about here. Community college? Some worthless liberal arts degree program that will leave you exactly where you are now, sitting on street corners, selling trinkets, and dreaming about a future that will never materialize? He turned to address the crowd directly, using the girl as a prop in his larger performance of superiority and dominance. "You see, this is exactly what's wrong with young people in this generation. They think the world owes them something just for existing. They think they deserve success and respect without earning it, without paying the price that real achievement demands from anyone who wants to rise above mediocrity." Richard was hitting his stride now, feeding off the crowd's attention and the girl's obvious discomfort like a performer who had found his rhythm. They want participation trophies instead of real competition. They want safe spaces instead of the harsh realities that build character. They want to be rewarded for effort and good intentions instead of actual accomplishment and measurable results. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word despite the obvious cruelty of what they were witnessing. Even the usual cacophony of Manhattan traffic seemed muted, as if the entire city were holding its breath to see how this confrontation would resolve itself. Success goes to people who are willing to fight for it, who are strong enough and smart enough to rise above their circumstances and make something meaningful of their lives, Richard declared with the authority of someone delivering a sermon. It doesn't go to people who sit on sidewalks, feeling sorry for themselves, making excuses for their failures, and expecting others to solve their problems for them. The girl was quiet for a long moment, and Richard thought he had finally broken her spirit, finally reduced her to the proper state of humility and deference that her situation warranted. But when she spoke, her voice carried an undertone that made him pause and question whether he had truly achieved the victory he was seeking. "You're right about one thing, sir. Success does go to people who work for it, people who don't give up even when others try to tear them down. But I think you might be wrong about what real success actually looks like." There was something in her tone that Richard found deeply unsettling, a confidence that didn't match her circumstances, a knowledge that seemed to go far beyond what someone in her position should possess. For a moment, he felt a flicker of genuine uncertainty, but he quickly pushed it aside and pressed forward with his attack. "Spare me the inspirational speech," he said, his voice dripping with contempt that was carefully calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage. "Save it for your community college counselor or whatever social worker told you that positive thinking and good intentions would somehow make up for lack of talent, ambition, and real-world experience." He gestured dismissively at her jewelry display. "In 5 years, you'll still be sitting on street corners trying to sell handmade trinkets to tourists, and I'll still be running this city, making decisions that affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. That's not pessimism or cruelty. That's simply reality, based on observable patterns and predictable outcomes. He gestured dismissively at her jewelry display. In 5 years, you'll still be sitting on street corners trying to sell handmade trinkets to tourists, and I'll still be running this city, making decisions that affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. That's not pessimism or cruelty. That's simply reality, based on observable patterns and predictable outcomes. The girl reached into her simple canvas bag, a worn piece that looked like it had accompanied her through many adventures and experiences. Richard noted with satisfaction that it wasn't a designer purse or even a decent imitation of one. It was exactly the sort of cheap, practical bag he would expect someone in her financial situation to carry, probably purchased at some discount store or thrift shop. She pulled out her phone, and Richard was pleased to see that it was nothing fancy or expensive, probably some budget Android model that barely functioned properly. Another confirmation of his assessment of her circumstances and her place in the economic hierarchy that governed all meaningful interactions in the modern world. But as she scrolled through something on the screen with practiced ease, her calm expression never changed or wavered. If anything, she seemed to grow more composed and centered, as if she were drawing strength and confidence from whatever information she was accessing. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, and Richard felt a genuine jolt of surprise and confusion at hearing his name spoken by this stranger. How did this nobody know who he was? Had someone in the growing crowd whispered his identity to her? Was this some kind of elaborate setup, some carefully orchestrated scheme designed to embarrass or blackmail him? "I think there's something important you should understand about reality and success, and what they actually mean in the real world," she continued, her voice taking on a new note of quiet authority that made Richard deeply uncomfortable in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "My name is Elena Richardson. Does that name mean anything to you, Mr. Sterling?" Richard felt his first real moment of confusion and growing dread since the confrontation had begun. Richardson. The name echoed in his mind like a bell tolling in the distance, familiar but elusive, carrying implications he wasn't sure he wanted to explore. He ran through his mental catalog of business associates, competitors, clients, and industry leaders, trying to place where he had heard that name before and why it was making him feel suddenly cold and uncertain. Richardson. Richardson. Why did that name make his stomach twist into knots of apprehension? Why did he suddenly feel like the ground was shifting beneath his expensive Italian shoes? "Should it mean something to me?" he asked, though his voice had lost some of its commanding authority and taken on a note of uncertainty that he hoped the crowd wouldn't notice. Elena smiled for the first time since their conversation had begun, and Richard was struck by how completely it transformed her face. It wasn't a cruel or mocking smile, wasn't triumphant or gloating in the way he might have expected from someone who had just gained some advantage in their confrontation. Instead, it held a quiet knowledge and understanding that made Richard feel exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. "Richardson Industries," she said simply, as if those 2 words should explain everything that needed explaining about their situation. "My grandfather founded the company 70 years ago with nothing but determination and a willingness to treat people fairly. My family currently owns about 65% of the commercial real estate in this city, including most of the historic buildings in this neighborhood." She paused, letting this information sink in before delivering what Richard somehow knew would be the decisive blow. including, if I'm not mistaken, the 40-story building at 200 Madison Avenue that currently houses the headquarters of Sterling Enterprises. The color drained from Richard's face so completely and suddenly that several people in the crowd noticed the dramatic change and began murmuring among themselves with growing excitement and anticipation. Richard's Industries, of course. How could he have forgotten or overlooked such an important detail about his own business operations? Richardson Industries was one of the largest and most established property management companies in the entire city, so large and influential that Richard rarely thought about them as competitors. They were more like a force of nature, an unchanging constant in the Manhattan real estate landscape, owning buildings that had been in their family for multiple generations and controlling vast networks of commercial properties through an intricate web of holding companies, trusts, and investment partnerships. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Richardson Industries was owned by some reclusive family that never appeared in public, never granted interviews to business publications, never attended the charity galas and industry conferences where Richard performed his success and cultivated his reputation. He had tried for years to arrange meetings with them, to negotiate better lease terms or explore opportunities for joint ventures, but they conducted all their business through multiple layers of lawyers, property managers, and corporate representatives. "That's impossible," Richard said, but his voice had lost all of its commanding authority and taken on a desperate quality that made several people in the crowd exchange knowing looks. "The Richardson family doesn't... They're not..." "They're not what, Mr. Sterling?" Elena's voice remained gentle and patient, but there was unmistakable steel underneath it now, the kind of quiet authority that came from genuine power rather than performed dominance. Not poor, not sitting on sidewalks selling handmade jewelry, not the kind of people you would expect to encounter during your important business day. She gestured calmly at her simple clothing and modest jewelry display. "You're absolutely right about that. We're not poor, not by any reasonable definition of that word. But we were raised with certain values, taught that wealth is a responsibility rather than a weapon, that true success means lifting others up rather than tearing them down." The crowd was beginning to murmur more loudly now, voices rising with excitement as people began to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Richard could hear fragments of conversation, people pulling out phones to search for information about Richardson Industries, someone saying, "Oh my God, she's actually telling the truth," in an awed voice that carried clearly across the sidewalk. The entire dynamic had shifted completely and irreversibly in a matter of seconds. Where moments before he had been the powerful figure humiliating a poor girl for the entertainment of his audience, now he was the one being exposed, the one whose assumptions and cruelties were being laid bare for everyone to see and judge. "I don't believe you," Richard said, but the words sounded weak and desperate even to his own ears. "Anyone can claim to be anyone these days. You could have found that information online and memorized it to impress people." Elena scrolled through her phone with practiced ease and held the screen out so he could see it clearly. It was the Richardson Industries website, professionally designed and obviously expensive, with the sort of understated elegance that only came from working with the very best designers and developers. There, prominently featured in the About Our Family section, was a high-quality photograph of Elena standing next to an elderly man in an expensive but understated suit. The man had kind eyes and a gentle smile, and he stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his worth to anyone, never needed to perform his success or demand recognition for his accomplishments. The caption beneath the photo read, "Elena Richardson,
heir apparent to Richardson Industries, with her grandfather and company founder, James Richardson, at the dedication of the Richardson Community Center in Brooklyn. Richard stared at the photo with growing horror, feeling his carefully constructed world crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. This was impossible, unthinkable, a complete reversal of everything he thought he understood about power, success, and social hierarchy. This girl, in her simple clothes and humble circumstances, sitting on a sidewalk like any common street vendor, was not only richer than he was, but she possessed the kind of generational wealth and influence that he had spent his entire career desperately trying to achieve.
She had more money than he did, more real power, more genuine influence over the city's economic landscape, and she had chosen to spend her afternoon selling handmade jewelry on a street corner, connecting with ordinary people in ways that he had never bothered to consider or attempt. "Why?" he asked, and his voice came out as barely a whisper, the question containing layers of meaning and confusion that he couldn't fully articulate. "Why are you here? Why didn't you stop me earlier? Why didn't you tell me who you were from the beginning? Why would someone with your advantages choose to live this way? Why am I sitting on a sidewalk selling jewelry if I come from a wealthy family?" Elena finished the question for him, understanding the deeper implications of what he was really asking. "Because my grandfather taught me something that apparently no one ever taught you, Mr. Sterling. He taught me that understanding people means living among them, sharing their experiences, seeing the world through their eyes rather than looking down at them from some ivory tower." She gestured to her jewelry display with the same care and attention she had shown throughout their entire encounter. "Because I believe that privilege should create empathy and understanding, not contempt and arrogance. Because I wanted to learn what life is really like for people who don't have trust funds and family connections to fall back on when things get difficult." Richard felt like he was drowning in the implications of what she was saying, struggling to process how completely wrong he had been about everything. Every assumption he had made, every cruel word he had spoken, every display of superiority had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who she was and what she represented. "I make these pieces myself," Elena continued, picking up one of her bracelets and examining it with obvious pride and affection, "in a workshop that my family helped me establish in our building in Red Hook. Every stone I select personally from suppliers I've developed relationships with over the past 2 years. Every wire I shape with tools I learned to use in metalworking classes I took at the Brooklyn Museum Art School. Every clasp and finding I attach with techniques I learned from master jewelers who have been practicing their craft for decades." She looked directly at Richard with those calm, intelligent eyes. "When people buy my jewelry, they're not purchasing a status symbol or a display of wealth. They're buying something I created with my own hands, something that represents hours of careful work and creative energy. They're connecting with me as a person, as an artist, not as an heir to a fortune or a representative of some corporate dynasty." The crowd was pressing closer now, drawn by the drama and the complete reversal of expectations they were witnessing. Richard could see phones everywhere, recording every moment of his humiliation from multiple angles. His public disgrace was being broadcast in real time across social media platforms, his cruelty preserved forever in digital form for millions of people to witness and judge. But more than his professional embarrassment or the damage to his carefully cultivated reputation, Richard felt a crushing sense of the magnitude of his moral failure. He had attacked someone who was not only innocent of any wrongdoing,
but who was actually using her privileged position to try to understand and connect with people less fortunate than herself. The building where Sterling Enterprises operates, Elena continued, her voice still calm and measured despite the drama and tension of the moment. It's been one of our family's properties for over 30 years. The lease comes up for renewal next month, and my grandfather and I will be making decisions about which tenants we want to continue working with going forward. She paused, letting the full implications of this statement sink in before continuing. We generally prefer to work with companies and individuals who share our values, who treat people with dignity and respect regardless of their economic circumstances, who understand that success comes with responsibilities to the broader community. The blood had completely drained from Richard's face now, leaving him pale and unsteady on his feet. His company's lease, the foundation of his entire business empire, was controlled by the family he had just insulted and humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses. How could he have been so careless, so completely unaware of such a fundamental aspect of his own business operations? He had been so focused on expansion and acquisition, so consumed with building his public image and demonstrating his success to competitors and colleagues, that he had left the mundane but crucial details of his main office lease to property managers and administrative assistants. But now, standing on this sidewalk, facing this remarkable young woman he had just tried to destroy, he realized that his entire professional life was built on a foundation controlled by people whose values he had just revealed himself to be completely opposed to. "Mr. Sterling," Elena said, and her voice held no anger or threat, just a quiet certainty that was more terrifying than any rage could have been. "I want you to understand something fundamental about power and success, and what they really mean when you strip away all the performance and pretense." Richard found himself hanging on her every word, desperate to understand how the situation had shifted so dramatically and what it might mean for his future. Real power doesn't come from expensive clothes or watches or the ability to humiliate people who can't fight back, she continued. It doesn't come from owning buildings or controlling leases or having enough money to buy whatever you want whenever you want it. She gestured to the crowd that had gathered around them, people from every walk of life who had been drawn by the confrontation and stayed for the revelation. Real power comes from using whatever advantages you have to create opportunities for others, to lift people up rather than tear them down, to build bridges instead of walls. The crowd around them had grown to well over 100 people now, including office workers on their lunch breaks, shoppers who had been drawn by the commotion, tourists with cameras, and even some of Richard's own employees who had recognized his voice and come to investigate what was happening. His reputation, built over decades of careful image management and strategic networking, was collapsing in real time as people recorded his cruelty and Elena's dignified response. But somehow, that seemed less important now than the growing understanding of how completely he had misjudged everything about this encounter and everything about what constituted real success. "My grandfather built Richardson Industries on a principle that guided every decision he made for 70 years, Elena said, her voice carrying easily across the now silent crowd. "He taught me to treat every person I meet as if they might one day be my equal, because they very well might be. More importantly, he taught me to treat people with dignity and respect, because that's what every human being deserves, regardless of their economic circumstances or social position." She looked directly at Richard, and he could see compassion in her eyes despite everything he had put her through. He started with nothing, just like you claim to have done, Mr. Sterling. He grew up in poverty, worked manual labor jobs, saved every penny he could for years before he was able to make his first real estate investment. Richard felt another wave of recognition and shame as he realized the parallels between Elena's grandfather's story and his own carefully edited mythology of self-made success. But he never forgot what it felt like to be looked down upon, to be dismissed as unimportant, to be treated as less than human by people who thought their money made them better than everyone else, Elena continued. He built his company on the principle that wealth should create opportunity and understanding, not arrogance and contempt. Richard tried to speak, to defend himself, or regain some control over the situation that had spiraled so completely beyond his ability to manage, but no words came. He felt exposed and vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before, stripped of all the protective layers of wealth and status and performance that he had spent his entire adult life constructing and maintaining. All his expensive clothes, his luxury accessories, his carefully constructed image of success and dominance meant absolutely nothing in the face of Elena's quiet dignity and genuine accomplishment. She had achieved something he was only beginning to understand the value of, the respect and admiration of others based on character rather than wealth, on actions rather than possessions. "I've been coming to this corner for 3 months now," Elena said, and Richard realized that this revelation made his attack on her even more cruel and misguided than he had initially understood. She hadn't chosen this location randomly or accidentally. She had been systematically observing and learning, connecting with the community in ways that he had never bothered to consider or attempt. "Every day after my classes at Columbia Business School," she continued, and Richard felt yet another shock as he realized she was pursuing the same advanced degree he had earned decades earlier, probably from the same professors and using the same case studies. "I come here and set up my display. Do you know what I've learned during these 3 months of sitting on this corner?" Richard shook his head mutely, no longer capable of speech or coherent thought. His entire understanding of the world had been turned upside down in the span of a few minutes, and he was struggling to process the implications of everything Elena was telling him. "I've learned that most people are fundamentally kind and decent when given the chance to show it," she said, her voice taking on a warmth and enthusiasm that made it clear how much these experiences had meant to her. "They stop and look at my work with genuine interest, even if they don't have money to buy anything. They ask thoughtful questions about my techniques, compliment specific design elements, share stories about jewelry that has special meaning in their own lives." She gestured to several people in the crowd who were nodding in recognition, apparently regular customers or familiar faces from her time on the corner. "Some people have opened up to me about their own struggles and dreams, their hopes for their children's futures, their fears about job security or health problems or family difficulties. I've made genuine friendships here, real connections with people who know nothing about my family name or my trust fund or my inheritance prospects." Elena paused and looked directly at Richard with those calm, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through all his defenses and pretenses. "But I've also encountered people like you, Mr. Sterling. People who believe that having money gives them the right to be cruel to anyone they perceive as being beneath them. People who think that someone's clothes or job or current circumstances tell the complete story of who they are and what they're capable of achieving." She shook her head with what looked like genuine sadness rather than anger. "People who use their advantages as weapons instead of tools for building something better, who mistake cruelty for strength and contempt for sophistication." Richard's phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the confrontation, vibrating against his leg like an increasingly frantic insect trapped in his pocket. Text messages and phone calls from his assistants, board members, public relations team, and business associates who had already seen the social media posts and videos that were spreading across the internet at viral speed. His carefully managed public image, the product of decades of strategic networking and calculated philanthropy, was imploding with the thoroughness and finality of a controlled demolition. Every cruel word he had spoken, every assumption he had made, every display of arrogance and contempt was being preserved and shared and discussed by thousands of people who were drawing their own conclusions about his character and his fitness to hold positions of power and responsibility. "Please," Richard said finally, the word escaping from his throat like a desperate plea for mercy. "I didn't know who you were. If I had known about your family, about Richardson Industries, I never would have spoken to you that way." "Would have what?" Elena interrupted, and for the first time since their confrontation began, her voice carried a sharp edge of genuine anger and disappointment. "Would have treated me with basic human dignity? Would have shown respect for another person trying to make an honest living? Would have recognized that every human being deserves to be treated with kindness, regardless of their bank account or family connections?" She took a step closer to him, and Richard found himself instinctively stepping backward, despite his considerable advantage in physical size and presence. "Don't you see what you just revealed about yourself and your values, Mr. Sterling? You think respect and decent treatment are things people have to earn based on their wealth or status or usefulness to you. You think kindness is a limited resource that should only be given to people who can somehow benefit your career or your social position." Her voice rose slightly, carrying across the silent crowd with unmistakable authority and moral clarity. "But respect and dignity are things that every human being deserves simply by virtue of being human. They're not rewards to be distributed based on someone's net worth or job title or family name." The crowd was no longer content to simply observe passively. People were taking sides with increasing vocal intensity, and it wasn't Richard's side they were choosing. Someone in the crowd called out, "She's right! Apologize to her properly!" Others joined in with growing volume and conviction. "You should be ashamed of yourself! How dare you treat another person like that? She deserves better than your fake apology!" Richard felt panic rising in his chest like floodwater, cold and overwhelming and completely beyond his control. This was supposed to have been a simple demonstration of his superiority, a routine reminder to everyone of the natural hierarchy that governed social and economic relationships. Instead, it had become his public trial and execution, with a jury of strangers who had witnessed his cruelty and found him morally bankrupt. "I'm sorry," he said desperately, but his voice was completely lost in the growing chorus of disapproval and condemnation from the crowd. Elena held up her hand with quiet authority, and the crowd fell silent almost immediately. There was something about her natural presence and dignity that commanded attention and respect without demanding or forcing it, the kind of authentic leadership that Richard had spent his entire career trying to fake and perform. "Mr. Sterling has something he wants to say," she announced calmly, giving him one final opportunity to salvage some small measure of dignity from the wreckage of his public humiliation. All eyes turned to Richard with expressions ranging from curious anticipation to outright hostility. More than 100 faces, representing every demographic and economic level of New York City society, all waiting to hear what he might say, to redeem himself, or at least demonstrate that he was capable of genuine remorse and personal growth. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Sterling felt completely powerless. He was no longer the master of the situation, no longer the one controlling the narrative or determining the outcome. He was entirely at the mercy of people whose good opinion he had never bothered to seek, and whose judgment he had never thought to fear. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice stronger and more clear this time, carrying it across the expectant silence. "I was completely wrong to speak to you the way I did. I was wrong to make assumptions about you based on your appearance and circumstances. I was wrong to try to humiliate you in public for the entertainment of strangers." The crowd listened with skeptical attention, but several voices called out that his apology wasn't sufficient. "That's it? That's all you have to say? What about all the terrible things you said about poor people? What about treating everyone with basic human decency?" Richard looked at Elena, who was watching him with patient but expectant eyes. He could see that she was waiting to discover what kind of person he really was beneath all his bluster and performance, waiting to learn whether he was capable of genuine self-reflection and moral growth, or whether his apology was just another strategic maneuver designed to minimize damage to his reputation and business interests. "I've spent my entire career believing that financial success meant I was better than other people," Richard said, his voice gaining strength and authenticity as he spoke from a place of genuine honesty rather than calculated image management. "I thought that having money gave me the right to look down on anyone who had less, to judge people based on their clothes or their jobs or their current circumstances." He looked at Elena, who was watching him with patient but expectant eyes. He could see that she was waiting to discover what kind of person he really was beneath all his bluster and performance, waiting to learn whether he was capable of genuine self-reflection and moral growth, or whether his apology was just another strategic maneuver designed to minimize damage to his reputation and business interests. "I've spent my entire career believing that financial success meant I was better than other people," Richard said, his voice gaining strength and authenticity as he spoke from a place of genuine honesty rather than calculated image management. "I thought that having money gave me the right to look down on anyone who had less, to judge people based on their clothes or their jobs or their current circumstances." He looked at Elena's jewelry display, really seeing it clearly for the first time since the confrontation had begun. The pieces were genuinely beautiful, displaying real artistic skill and sophisticated craftsmanship. The silverwork was intricate and professional, the stones carefully selected and expertly set, the overall designs showing creativity and technical competence that would have impressed him if he had encountered them in an expensive boutique rather than on a street corner. "I was completely and utterly wrong about everything," Richard continued, his voice carrying increasing conviction as he spoke. "Your jewelry is beautiful and skillfully made. You're clearly talented and dedicated to your craft, and you're working hard to build something meaningful with your own hands and creative energy." He paused, struggling to find words that could adequately express the magnitude of his realization and regret. "I had no right to mock your efforts, or question your choices, or treat you as if you were somehow less worthy of respect and dignity than anyone else. I had no right to assume that I knew anything about your character, or your character circumstances, or your future potential, based on a few minutes of observation." Elena nodded slowly, and Richard could see something shifting in her expression as she evaluated his words and tried to determine whether his apparent transformation was genuine or merely another performance designed to serve his own interests. But Richard wasn't finished. Something had broken open inside him during this confrontation, some dam that had been holding back years of suppressed doubt and unexamined assumptions about what constituted real success and meaningful achievement. Words were continuing to pour out that he had never expected to say, truths that he had never allowed himself to acknowledge or examine.
I've been so obsessed with building my business empire and proving my success to competitors and colleagues that I completely lost sight of what that success was supposed to be for," he said, his voice taking on a quality of genuine reflection that was completely different from his usual calculated pronouncements. "I've spent decades stepping on other people to climb higher in the corporate hierarchy, believing that their struggles and failures were somehow proof of my own superiority and worthiness. But standing here now, looking at what you've chosen to do with your advantages and opportunities, I realize that I've been completely wrong about everything that actually matters in life." The crowd was listening with rapt attention now, their anger and hostility beginning to transform into something more complex and nuanced as they witnessed what appeared to be a genuine moment of self-reflection and potential redemption. "Elena," Richard said, using her name with conscious respect and recognition for the first time since their encounter had begun, "I understand that words are easy and actions are difficult. And I know that nothing I say right now can undo the cruelty I showed you or erase the assumptions I made about you." He took a deep breath, gathering courage for what he knew would be the most important statement of his professional life. "But I want you to know that you've taught me something today that I should have learned decades ago. Something that will change how I think about success and power and my responsibilities to other people for the rest of my life." Elena's expression had softened considerably, and Richard could see genuine curiosity and perhaps even hope in her eyes as she waited to hear what he had learned from their confrontation. Real strength and real success don't come from having power over other people or being able to intimidate and humiliate anyone you perceive as being weaker than yourself, Richard said, his voice carrying complete conviction now. "They come from using whatever advantages and opportunities you have to lift other people up, to create possibilities and hope where none existed before, to build bridges instead of walls." Elena smiled, and this time her expression was warm and genuine, transforming her entire face in a way that made Richard understand how completely he had misjudged her from the very beginning of their encounter. "My grandfather always said that wisdom is the only form of wealth that increases when you give it away freely to others," she said quietly. Richard felt something fundamental shift in his chest, a loosening of tension and anxiety that he hadn't even realized he had been carrying for years, or perhaps decades. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt genuinely humble, rather than performing humility for strategic advantage. Not the calculated false modesty he displayed at charity events and business conferences, but real humility, born from recognizing how much he still had to learn about being a decent human being, worthy of the success he had achieved. "What you're doing here on this corner," he said, gesturing to her jewelry display with newfound respect and understanding. "It's not really about making money or building a business, is it?" "No," Elena replied thoughtfully. "It's about connection and community and understanding. It's about creating something beautiful with my own hands and sharing it with people who can appreciate craftsmanship and artistry for their own sake, rather than as status symbols or displays of wealth." She looked around at the crowd that was still gathered, many of whom were now examining her jewelry with genuine interest and asking questions about her techniques and inspirations. "What you're doing here on this corner," he said, gesturing to her jewelry display with newfound respect and understanding. "It's not really about making money or building a business, is it?" "No," Elena replied thoughtfully. "It's about connection and community and understanding.
It's about creating something beautiful with my own hands and sharing it with people who can appreciate craftsmanship and artistry for their own sake, rather than as status symbols or displays of wealth. She looked around at the crowd that was still gathered, many of whom were now examining her jewelry with genuine interest and asking questions about her techniques and inspirations. It's about recognizing that everyone has a story worth hearing, that everyone has struggles and dreams and hopes that deserve to be acknowledged and respected. You can't learn those things sitting in a corporate boardroom 40 floors above the street, analyzing market reports and financial projections. You have to be here, among people, listening to their experiences and sharing your own. The crowd was beginning to disperse gradually, sensing that the confrontation had transformed into something more complex and less dramatically satisfying than they had initially expected. But many people lingered, reluctant to leave, and Richard watched with growing fascination as Elena interacted with each person individually. She gave every customer her complete attention, answering their questions with detailed knowledge and obvious passion for her craft, sharing stories about where she had found particular stones or what had inspired specific designs. This was what he had been missing throughout his entire career, Richard realized with growing clarity. This was what real success actually looked like. Not the fear and deference he commanded through wealth and corporate power, but the genuine respect and affection that came from treating people as fellow human beings worthy of attention and care, regardless of their economic circumstances or potential usefulness to his business interests. "Elena," Richard said quietly, when most of the crowd had moved on and they had a moment of relative privacy, "I know I have absolutely no right to ask this after everything I put you through today, but would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime?" Elena looked at him with those calm, intelligent eyes, clearly trying to evaluate whether his apparent transformation was genuine or simply another calculated performance designed to advance his own interests.
"What would we talk about?"
She asked carefully. "I'd like to learn how to be the kind of person who actually deserves the success I've achieved," Richard said, and the honesty in his voice surprised even him with its intensity and vulnerability. "I've spent so many years focused on accumulating more wealth and power and status that I completely forgot how to be a decent human being who contributes something positive to the world." He paused, struggling to articulate feelings and realizations that were still forming in his mind. "Maybe you could help me understand how to use what I've built for something better than just making myself richer and more powerful. Maybe you could teach me what your grandfather understood about the real responsibilities that come with wealth and influence." Elena considered this request for a long moment, studying his face and apparently trying to determine whether she could trust his stated intentions or whether this was simply another manipulation designed to serve his business interests. "I think my grandfather would be interested in that conversation," she said finally. "He always believed that the best leaders and the most successful business people are the ones who never stop learning and growing, especially from people who see the world differently than they do." As Elena began carefully packing up her jewelry display, wrapping each piece in tissue paper with the same attention to detail she had shown throughout their entire encounter, Richard found himself kneeling on the sidewalk to help her, without being asked or invited to participate. His expensive suit was getting dusty and wrinkled from contact with the concrete, his perfectly polished shoes were being scuffed, and his carefully groomed appearance was being compromised in ways that would have horrified him just hours earlier. But for the first time in his adult life, he genuinely didn't care how he looked to the people passing by, or what they might think about his dignity or professional image. "Elena,"
he said as they worked together in companionable silence. "What's going to happen with my company's lease renewal next month?" Elena looked at him thoughtfully, clearly weighing his words and actions from their encounter, trying to determine what kind of business relationship might be possible between Richardson Industries and Sterling Enterprises going forward. "That depends entirely on you, Mr. Sterling. What kind of landlord do you think my family should be?" Richard understood immediately that this was both a practical question about business policies and a deeper test of what he had learned from their confrontation, and whether his apparent transformation would translate into concrete changes in his behavior and business practices.
"Fair and supportive," he said without hesitation. "Willing to work with tenants who are genuinely trying to build something meaningful and contribute positively to their communities, even when they face temporary financial difficulties or market challenges." He paused, thinking carefully about the implications of what he was saying. Interested in developing long-term relationships based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than simply extracting maximum profits from every transaction. "And what kind of tenant do you think you should be?" Elena asked, and Richard could hear the deeper question she was really asking about the kind of person and leader he intended to become. "The kind who remembers that success and wealth create responsibilities to other people, not just opportunities for personal advantage," Richard said, speaking with growing conviction about principles he was only beginning to understand and internalize. "The kind who looks for ways to lift up other people and create opportunities for them, instead of stepping on them to climb higher." He met her gaze directly. "The kind who uses his influence and resources to make the community stronger and more prosperous, rather than just making himself richer and more powerful." "Then I think Richardson Industries and Sterling Enterprises could have a very productive and mutually beneficial relationship going forward," Elena said, with a genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. As they stood up together after finishing with the jewelry display, Richard realized that the entire dynamic between them had changed completely and irreversibly. He was no longer the arrogant businessman attempting to humiliate a poor girl for his own entertainment. They were two people who had learned something profound about each other and about themselves. Two individuals who might actually be able to work together to create something positive and meaningful in the world. "Elena," Richard said as they prepared to part ways, "I hope you'll continue coming to this corner, not because you need the income, but because the people here need what you're offering them. You're teaching them something important about dignity and creativity and what it means to build something beautiful with your own hands." Elena laughed, a warm and genuine sound that made Richard realize how rarely he heard authentic laughter anymore. Most of the laughter in his world was calculated and strategic, designed to curry favor or advance agendas or demonstrate allegiance to whoever held power in any given situation. "I think I've learned as much from them as they have from me," Elena said with obvious affection for the community she had become part of. "Maybe more. Every person who stops to look at my jewelry teaches me something new about kindness, about what people value beyond money and status, about what makes life meaningful and worth living." As they walked in opposite directions, Richard heading slowly back toward his office building, and Elena moving toward the subway with her bag of jewelry and her quiet dignity intact, Richard experienced something he hadn't felt in years, or perhaps decades. Not the aggressive, grasping hope for more wealth or power or recognition, but a quiet, sustainable hope that he might still have time to become a better person. Hope that it wasn't too late to learn what Elena's grandfather had understood from the beginning of his career, that true success was measured not by what you accumulated for yourself, but by what you contributed to others, and how you used your advantages to make the world a little bit better for everyone.